Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where forgotten American history is brought back to life. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss these haunting tales now. Let us begin the story of Unveiling the Blackwell. Mystery, a tale of sin and silence, *. In the quiet corners of America's past, there are stories that never found their way into schoolbook stories whispered in family kitchens or kept alive by the creak of an old rocking chair on a front porch. These were the stories people were too ashamed to tell aloud, but too haunted to forget. They lingered in the air like smoke from a dying fire, heavy and bitter and impossible to clear away. One of these stories came from the late 19th century, a time when small towns were stitched together by faith, by gossip, and by the heavy silence that surrounded scandal. The Blackwell family was once thought of as decent, God-fearing people, but beneath the neat white paint of their farmhouse walls lay something far darker, a secret that began in whispers and ended in silence. Blackwells lived on the edge of town, where the land gave way to woods and the road narrowed into a dirt path. Their farm was like so many others, with worn fences, a sagging barn, and fields that gave just enough to survive. The father, Thomas Blackwell, was a tall, stern man with rough hands and a gaze that could unsettle anyone who dared to meet it. His wife, Margaret, was quiet always, with her eyes downcast, as though she had forgotten how to look at the world with hope together. They had two daughters, Abigail and Ruth, both of whom would grow into young women of uncommon beauty in a place where beauty often drew more trouble than kindness. Abigail, the elder, carried herself with a solemn air. She was soft-spoken, with dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken thoughts. Ruth, by contrast, was lighter in spirit, always laughing, always quick with a word to soften even the harshest mood. They were sisters, bound not just by blood, but by the heavy presence of their father, who ruled their home like a man convinced he had the right to shape every soul. Inside those walls, the neighbors saw the Blackwells at church every Sunday, sitting straight in their pew, silent and obedient. They saw Margaret with her hands folded tightly, Abigail with her gaze lowered, and Ruth glancing out the window as if searching for an escape. What they did not see was what went on when the hymn books closed and the townspeople went home. The late 1800s was a time when families guarded their reputation with a fierceness that often crushed. The truth scandals did not simply stain a name, they ruined it forever. In towns where everyone knew each other's business, where whispers carried faster than the wind, a family would sooner choose silence than expose shame, and so the Blackwell story was never spoken of directly. Instead, it was pieced together through the things left unsaid, the sudden shifts in conversation. When their name arose, the way older folks would look away when someone asked about the sisters, what happened inside the Blackwell house was hidden but not forgotten, not by those who had lived near enough to hear cries carried on the wind, not by the women who once dared to comfort Margaret only to be pushed away. Was Ruth who first began to change. Neighbors remembered how her laughter grew strained, how her once bright spirit seemed weighed down. She stopped running barefoot through the fields, stopped humming tunes when she fetched water. Her shoulders curved inward as though she carried a burden she could not speak of. Some said Thomas had grown harsher, that his temper had become violent. Others hinted at something far worse, but dared not name it. It was Abigail, though, who bore the heavier silence. She moved like a ghost through town, rarely speaking, barely glancing at anyone, as though she lived behind a wall no one else could see. Years later, old women would say they had noticed the signs. They had seen the way Thomas lingered near his daughters, the way Margaret shrank into herself when he entered a room. But in those days, it was not something to speak of. A man was head of the household, and his rule was not to be questioned. No one dared accuse a father of sin, not openly, not when the church preached obedience, not when a woman's word meant so little against a Manson. Autumn night in 1892, a farmhand passing the Blackwell property swore he heard voices raised inside the house, followed by a long wail that did not sound entirely human. He kept walking, quickened his pace, and told himself it was nothing more than a quarrel. Yet the next Sunday, when the Blackwells took their place in church, Ruth's face bore a hollow look, and Abigail's hands trembled as she turned the thin pages of the hymnal. The townsfolk said nothing. They bowed their heads and prayed as time passed. Ruth began to fade away. Her body grew thinner, her eyes darker. She no longer came to town with Margaret to buy flour or fabric. She no longer sang, she no longer laughed. Some said she looked more like a prisoner than a daughter. Abigail grew sterner, colder, her beauty sharpening into something severe. Neighbors whispered behind hands that Thomas was too close to his daughters, that Margaret looked more servant than wife, but no one dared speak a word aloud in that age. Silence was easier than truth. By the spring of 1894, Ruth was gone, they said. She had taken ill and died quickly, they said. The earth was too damp, that the fever took her as it took so many. But those who had seen her weeks before swore she was not sick, only broken. She was buried in the churchyard, a plain wooden cross marking her grave. The service was brief. Thomas stood with his jaw clenched, Abigail silent at his side, Margaret weeping into her shawl. The preacher spoke of God's will, but the congregation left uneasy. A girl so young should not have been taken so soon, yet no one questioned it aloud. After Ruth's death, the house grew even quieter. Abigail rarely left the farm. Margaret seemed to waste away. Thomas carried himself with even greater severity. His voice was iron, his eyes darker than before. Neighbors avoided him when they could. Even the preacher offered only stiff greetings. Some said the Blackwell farm was cursed, that no joy could live within its walls anymore, but the truth lingered heavier than curses. It lived in Abigail's silence and in Margaret's hollow gaze. By the summer of 1896, Abigail was seen walking alone through town. At dusk, her face pale, her steps slow. People said she looked haunted. They whispered that she often visited Ruth's grave late at night, staying until the early hours. Neighbors claimed they saw her lips moving, as if she spoke to her sister, though no one dared approach. A few said they heard her cry out in the dark, but none went near. Some things were better left to shadows. Then in the winter of 1897, the silence broke. Thomas Blackwell was found dead in his own bed, his chest heavy, his face pale, as though life had left him in the night. The doctor claimed it was the heart that failed, though he admitted quietly that the look on Thomas's face was strange. His eyes were wide, as if he had seen something terrible before the end. Abigail was the one who found him, they said. She did not weep, she only stood at the foot of the bed and stared. Margaret collapsed with grief, but Abigail moved with a calmness that unsettled those who saw her. She arranged the funeral with cold efficiency. She stood over her father's coffin with a face carved in stone. It was at that funeral when the rumors grew stronger. Some said Thomas had not died of natural causes, that perhaps his past had caught up with him, that perhaps silence had finally been broken. A few whispered Abigail's name under their breath, as if she had played a hand in ending her father's reign. No one dared accuse her openly, but the shadow of suspicion clung to her like a shroud. The Blackwell house stood for many years after that, but it was never the same. Margaret grew frail and quiet. Often seen wandering the fields in her shawl, Abigail ran the farm alone, her face set in that same haunted calm. The neighbors kept their distance. The story of the Blackwells became a kind of warning, a tale told in hushed tones by firelight, about what happens when sin festers in silence, about how some families rot from the inside out. The truth of what happened behind those walls was never written down, never confessed, only carried in the uneasy memories of those who lived near enough to sense it. And so the Blackwell name faded into legend, a dark reminder of how silence can destroy a family more thoroughly than any storm or fire. The daughters who once laughed in the fields became symbols of sorrow. The father who ruled with iron became a ghost whispered of, but never mourned, and the mother who could not speak lived out her Years in shadows, the Blackwell mystery was never solved, not in any official sense, but it was never forgotten, for in towns like those, the past never truly dies. It lingers in the soil, in the houses that sag with memory, in the stories that refuse to fade. And though the Blackwell farm eventually fell to ruin, though the family name slipped from the records, the whispers remain, carried from one generation to the next, retold with the same shiver of dread, a tale of sin and silence, a tale that reminds us that history is not only about the battles and victories, but also about the secrets that families would do anything to hide. After Thomas Blackwell was lowered into the ground on that bitter winter day of 1897, the town tried to move on, as it always did. Farmers returned to their fields, shopkeepers opened their doors, children played in the dirt streets, but though life carried on, the memory of his funeral left a heaviness that did not lift. Some said it was because of the coldness in Abigail's eyes. Others said it was because Margaret's wails had carried longer than the preacher's words. Whatever the reason, the Blackwell farm no longer seemed like any other place. It had become something heavier. A presence rather than a home. Abigail now ran the farm alone. She was 25 years old, a young woman still, but her face had already taken on the worn look of someone who had lived twice her years. She woke before dawn, milked the cow, worked the fields, mended the fences, all with the same steady, unbroken rhythm. The neighbors who saw her said she moved like a machine, never pausing, never sighing, never laughing. No one could remember the last time she had smiled. Some said her silence was strength. Others thought it was guilt, but no one dared ask. Margaret drifted further into her sorrow. She was seen wandering the edges of the property, her shawl pulled tight around her thin shoulders as if she were trying to hold herself together. People whispered that she talked to Ruth when she walked the fields, that sometimes she sat by the fence and whispered into the air, as though her daughter could still hear her. Abigail let her be, never calling her back inside, never trying to stop her. She seemed to know that her mother was slipping into another world, one where grief was the only companion left. The townspeople kept their distance from the Blackwells. After Thomas's death, some families still spoke politely when they passed Abigail at church, but their eyes always carried the same quiet suspicion. A woman living alone without a husband or brother to protect her was already a subject of talk. Add to it the whispers that her father had not died naturally, and Abigail became a figure half feared, half pitied. Men avoided her because her beauty seemed to carry a curse. Women avoided her because her silence seemed too heavy to bear, and children whispered her name in dares, running past the Blackwell farm after dark, as though her shadow might reach out and catch them. The old farm itself began to look different to the eye. The paint peeled, the shutters sagged, the barn leaned as though the weight of the family's sins pressed down upon it. No laughter, no music, no warmth ever seemed to come from its walls. Only silence. That silence carried far beyond the property line, as if the land itself wanted to remember the suffering that had soaked into its soil. One story that spread through the town in hushed tones was told by a young boy named Samuel, whose family lived less than a mile from the Blackwells. He claimed that on more than one occasion he had seen Abigail walking the fields at night, her lantern glowing faintly through the mist. He swore that she did not walk alone, that he could see another figure beside her, a woman's shape. Though Margaret was often asleep by then, Samuel said it was Ruth. He was sure of it, that the Blackwell sisters still walked together long after one had been buried. His father struck him for telling such tales, but the boy held firm to his story for the rest of his life. Another tale came from a woman named Clara Thompson, who often delivered fabric and sewing supplies to Margaret before Ruth had died. Clara said that one evening in the spring of 1898, she passed near the Blackwell property and heard a sound that made her blood turn cold. It was a woman's voice, low and trembling, whispering words she could not make out, followed by another voice, younger, higher, but full of anguish. Clara did not stop to listen. She hurried home, her hands shaking. She never told her husband the full story, but years later, when she was an old woman, she confessed that she believed Abigail was not alone in that house, that the past had not been buried with Ruth. despite the whispers. Abigail carried on. She worked the farm year after year with no help but her own. Her body grew lean, her hands rough, her face pale. She rarely came into town, and when she did, her presence unsettled the room. She would stand in the corner of the store, her voice quiet, her eyes sharp like glass. People served her quickly, eager to send her on her way. When she walked back up the dirt road with her sack of flour or a spool of thread behind her, every door she passed seemed to close. Was during these years that the Blackwell story began to shift from gossip into legend. Parents warned their daughters not to stray too far from home, using Abigail as the cautionary tale. They whispered that sin had lived in that house, that silence had allowed it to grow, and that God himself had cursed the family. A girl who grew up in those years would later recall that her mother told her never to look into Abigail's eyes for fear of what she might see there. For the Blackwell name was now more than a family name. It was a shadow that stretched across the town. By 1901, Margaret had grown so frail she could no longer walk the fields. She spent her days in bed, her once gentle face hollow and gray. Abigail cared for her, but not with tenderness. Neighbors said she tended to her mother with the same cold efficiency with which she had tended the farm. Margaret died quietly in her sleep one gray morning with only Abigail by her side. The funeral was smaller than Thomas's. Only a few women from the church attended. Abigail stood alone, once again, her eyes fixed on the coffin, as though she had already buried her mother long before. With Margaret gone, the house became emptier still. Abigail now lived in near total solitude. The silence thickened around her. The farm seemed to decay faster. Fences breaking, barns sagging, fields going untended, as though the land itself was tired of carrying the weight of the Blackwell scenes. Yet Abigail remained. People said she often stood at the window at night, staring out toward the churchyard where Ruth and her parents lay. They wondered if she spoke to them, if she asked for forgiveness or cursed them in the darkness. In those years, small events began to feed the legend of the Blackwells further. Travelers passing through claimed they saw lights flickering in the Blackwell windows. Long after midnight, though, Abigail was known to sleep early. A group of young men dared each other to walk past the farm one night and swore they heard weeping from the barn. Another said he saw a figure in white at the upstairs window, though no woman lived there anymore but Abigail. And then there was the preacher who admitted quietly to a fellow clergyman that he had been called to the farm one night by Abigail herself. He never told anyone else what she confessed, only that her eyes were hollow and her voice shook with something more than fear. He left the farm pale and shaken and never returned. By 1905. Abigail was nearly 34, unmarried, childless, and alone. Her beauty had hardened into something severe, her hair streaked with gray. Her name had become a warning in town, used to hush children into obedience. Do not lie, or you'll end up like Abigail Blackwell. Do not keep secrets, or the curse will fall upon you too. She had become less a woman than a story, and perhaps that was what she had always been, a story of silence, of sin, of the things a family will bury until the weight becomes too much to carry. That autumn Abigail was found dead in her bed, much like her father before her. No one knew what caused it. The doctor said her body had simply given out from years of toil and loneliness. She was buried beside her family in the churchyard. No husband, no children to mourn her. Only a handful of townspeople came to stand in the cold ground as her coffin was lowered. The preacher spoke briefly, his words hollow against the silence. Abigail left behind, and so the Blackwell farm stood empty, the windows dark, the fields overgrown. Some said the land itself sighed with relief. Others said it grew more haunted. Without the living to mask the past, the house remained for many years, decaying slowly as storms tore at the roof and weeds claimed the foundation. But the memory of the Blackwells did not decay. It grew into something else, something that mothers whispered to their children when the wind howled through the trees, and something young men dared each other to speak of when the night grew too quiet. The Blackwells were gone, but their silence was not theirs, was a story that belonged not to the Living but to the land itself, what truth lay within the Blackwell house no one ever fully knew. Whether Thomas had ruled his daughters with violence, whether Abigail had taken his life in secret, whether Ruth's death was fever or something far darker, no one ever put to record what lived in memory was not the facts, but the feeling, the heaviness, the dread, the silence that seemed to scream louder than words. That was the true legacy of the Blackwells, and it was one the town would carry for generations. After Abigail was laid to rest beside her family, the earth above the Blackwell graves seemed to breathe with an uneasy stillness. The townspeople believed the story was finished, that with the last Blackwell buried the curse would finally fade. But time showed otherwise, for the story did not end with death. In some ways, it only began. The farm stood empty, its windows hollow like darkened eyes, staring out over the land. The roof sagged, the shutters beat against the walls with every storm. The weeds grew tall around the porch, and the fields once plowed and tended with such bitter determination now rolled wild with grass. The place became a skeleton of itself, and yet it drew people as if the silence inside those walls whispered a call that few could resist at first. It was children who dared to wander near. Boys in ragged boots would sneak through the fields under the pale moon and press their faces to the cracked glass of the windows. They told each other they saw shapes moving inside, shadows that did not belong to broken furniture or falling curtains. Some said they heard footsteps on the floorboards. Above them, though, no one had lived there for years. A girl once swore she saw a woman at the window, her face pale, her eyes hollow, as if the house itself had worn Abigail's sorrow as a masked parents scolded their children, warned them never to go near that cursed farm, but the warnings only made the dares more enticing. By 1910, the Blackwell house had become a place of fearful fascination. Travelers passing through town were told not to camp near the property, not because of thieves or wild animals, but because the land carried a darkness that would not let a soul sleep in peace. A peddler who ignored the warning set up his wagon by the fence, and later claimed he woke to the sound of weeping so close to his ear he felt the warmth of breath against his cheek. But when he lit his lantern, no one stood near. He packed his things at once and left town before sunrise, swearing never to return. Older townsfolk refused to speak of the Blackwells at all. For them, the memory was not a story, but a wound best left closed. When pressed, they would only shake their heads, mutter that the past had been cursed from the beginning, and walk away. Yet silence has a way of feeding legends more than words ever could. And so the younger generations shaped the Ozzy Blackwell tale into something darker. With every telling, they said Ruth's spirit walked the field, still searching for the freedom she never found. They said Thomas roamed the upstairs halls, his eyes burning with fury. They said Abigail's ghost stood guard at the window, waiting for anyone who dared to come too close to the truth. And they said Margaret's sorrow hung in the house like a heavy shawl, suffocating anyone who stepped inside. In 1915, a fire broke out on the edge of the Blackwell property. Some said it was lightning that struck the old barn. Others whispered it was boys trying to smoke out the spirits. Whatever the cause, the flames rose high into the night sky, illuminating the rotted beams and casting long shadows across the fields. The fire consumed the barn and spread to the farmhouse walls. Townspeople rushed to the scene with buckets of water, forming a line from the creek, but many swore their efforts were met with strange resistance. The fire hissed as if fed by unseen breath. The smoke clung thick in the air, refusing to rise. A man who had run into the house to salvage a piece of furniture stumbled out, pale-faced, claiming he had heard voices inside, whispering his name over and over. By morning, the barn was reduced to ash, and half the farmhouse charred black, though the mainframe still stood. The fire only deepened the legend. Some believed the house had refused to burn completely, as though it would not allow the story to end. Others said the flames had stirred the spirits trapped inside, and that now they wandered further than Before a family who lived a mile down the road claimed their youngest child woke screaming night after night, saying a woman stood at the foot of her bed with hollow eyes. Another farmer said his cows grew restless whenever the wind carried smoke. From the direction of the ruins, the Blackwells were gone, but the weight of their silence seemed to grow heavier with every passing year. By the 1920s, the town itself had begun to change. Railroads and new roads brought more people through, and with them new voices eager for stories to tell. The Blackwell farm became a curiosity for travelers who had heard whispers of its haunted past. They came with notebooks and cameras, eager to capture proof of the curse. Some walked away, laughing, dismissing it as nothing more than a tale born of superstition, but others left shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen. One man said he found a Bible in the ruins, its pages untouched by fire, but its words blackened as though scorched from within. Another claimed he heard a woman humming a tune, though the house was empty and the wind still. Though townspeople grew weary of outsiders stirring up what they had tried to bury, a preacher in those years spoke openly for the first time, condemning the fascination with the Blackwell story. He said the sins of that family were between them and God, that the dead should not be disturbed. Yet his sermon only fueled the fire. Outsiders wanted to know what sins he spoke of. What darkness could have been so great that even a man of the cloth shuddered at the memory? The preacher never spoke of it again, but the silence said more than words ever could. Generations passed, but the story endured. By the 1930s, the children who once whispered the Blackwell name in dares had grown into adults, and they carried the tale with them. The house was still standing, though crumbling more with each season. Windows, shattered roof, collapsed in places, but still the bones of the farmhouse clung to the land. Some said it refused to fall because the spirits inside had no rest. Others said it stood as a reminder to all who passed that sin leaves marks deeper than wood or stone. It was during the Depression, when hardship pressed heavy upon everyone, that the Blackwell land was nearly bought by a family desperate for a farm to call their own. The price was low, the soil still good for planting, but when word spread that they meant to move into the house, the town rose against it. Neighbors pleaded, begged them not to go there, warned them that no crop grown in that soil would bring joy. The family left before making the purchase. Some said it was the neighbors who convinced them. Others whispered that the family themselves spent one night in the house and left before dawn, pale and shaken, refusing to speak a word of what had driven them away. The years stretched on. The Blackwell farm became more ruin than house. Yet even ruin can hold a presence. People still avoided walking near it after dark. Still claimed they heard voices when the wind carried just right. Still said the earth around the graves never seemed to grow flowers, no matter how many seeds blew across the ground. The place became less a home and more a wound in the land. By the 1940s and 50s, when the world was consumed by wars and new beginnings, the Blackwell story became something told to children who had never even seen the house. Mothers used it to warn against secrets. Fathers used it to caution against disobedience. It was no longer a memory, but a moral, a story that reminded everyone that silence could be more dangerous than truth, that the sins hidden inside a house could rot it from the inside until even death could not wash it clean. Yet there were still those who sought the truth. A historian passing through in the late 1950s collected stories from the oldest residents. He asked about Thomas and Margaret, about Abigail and Ruth. Some refused to speak, while others offered only fragments. One woman swore that Abigail had confessed to poisoning her father. Another claimed Ruth had died, not of fever, but of despair. Still another insisted Margaret had known everything, but said nothing out of fear. The historian filled notebooks with their words, but he never found a clear truth, only the same silence, the same shadows. He left town unsettled, admitting that the Blackwell story was not history in the usual sense, but something heavier, something that lived between truth and legend. And so the Blackwell name lingered year after year. The farm crumbled until little remained but the foundation stones and the broken chimney. yet even then the land seemed to whisper. When children ran through the fields, they came home pale, claiming they felt watched. When hunters strayed too close, they swore they heard footsteps behind them. Though no one was there, the story had outlived, the family had outlived the house itself. It had become part of the land, part of the town, part of the memory of anyone who dared listen too closely. By the time the 1960s arrived, the Blackwell mystery had become folklore. A tale retold around campfires, a ghost story whispered at sleepovers, a reminder that even in modern times, the past could still reach out with cold hands. Some laughed it off, some dismissed it as nothing more than superstition, but others knew better. They knew that stories like the Blackwells did not survive for nearly 70 years without reason. They knew that silence leaves echoes, and those echoes never truly fade. By the time the old century gave way to the new one, the Blackwell name had already turned to ash in the mouths of the ex-townspeople. The family itself was gone, the farmhouse had fallen, and yet the story endured stronger than ever. The truth had rotted away, leaving behind only bones of memory scattered and gnawed by time. But bones can tell their own story, and the Blackwell bones spoke louder with each generation. The 1970s young people, hungry for thrills, began to seek out the ruins of the Blackwell farm. The town had grown more modern now. Electricity ran through its veins, cars filled the streets, television sets glowed in living rooms, but the land where the Blackwells had lived remained untouched, a hollow pocket of another century. The foundation stones were still there, the chimney leaning like a gravestone to the past. Weeds swallowed the yard, trees pressed close as though eager to hide what remained, and yet people went. Some went to prove their bravery, some went to prove the legend false, some went because the human heart cannot resist the pull of mystery. They returned with stories. Some laughed, saying it was only a ruin, nothing more than stone and ash, but others spoke of strange things. A group of teenagers claimed that when they sat among the ruins, one girl began to cry without knowing why. Her tears fell heavy, her shoulders shook, but she swore no sadness belonged to her. Another boy said he felt a hand brush against his arm, though no one stood near him. And one whispered he had seen a woman kneeling among the weeds, her head bent, her lips moving in prayer. When he blinked, she was gone. The town grew uneasy again, as the Blackwell farm became a place of pilgrimage for those who did not understand what they were seeking. Elders shook their heads, warning the young not to stir. Old ghosts, but the warnings sounded weaker now. In a world moving so fast, the past seemed less heavy, less threatening, and yet for those who went out to that land on quiet nights, the silence remained the same silence that had lived inside those walls when Thomas ruled his family, the same silence that pressed down on Margaret's shoulders, the same silence that hollowed Abigail's eyes, silence heavier than stone. By the 1980s, the story of the Blackwells began to appear in books about haunted places of America. Writers came through scribbling notes, eager to turn whispers into pages. They asked about dates and deaths, about who had lived and who had died. But they found no record that told the whole tale. Official documents were scarce. Birth records showed names. Marriage licenses showed Thomas and Margaret. The church held a record of Ruth's death, though only marked by the word fever. Thomas's death was written as heart failure, Margaret's as consumption, and Abigail's as natural causes. The records were ordinary, but the people were not, for the story carried more weight than any ink on paper could bear. And so, the writers filled the gaps with the voices of townsfolk, with the memories that had outlived the house. They left with books that mixed fact and legend, and readers far away shivered at the thought that such a family could have lived, that such silence could have been real. But for those who lived in the shadow of the Blackwell land, the story was never just a ghost tale to be read on a rainy night. It was something heavier. It was a memory woven into the soil of the town. Mothers still warned their children to stay away. Fathers still shook their heads at the mention of the name, and the churchyard where the family lay remained a place people passed quickly by. Their graves were simple stones worn smooth by wind and rain, their names barely legible, but their presence strong. Abigail, Ruth, Thomas, Margaret, they lay side by side, bound together even in death by the silence that had destroyed them in life. By the 1990s, the farmhouse was nothing more than rubble. The stones of the foundation had sunk into the earth, the chimney had collapsed into a pile of broken brick. Trees grew thick where the walls once stood, roots twisted through the remains as if the earth itself wanted to claim the story and hold it forever. But still the legend lived. Teenagers still dared one another to visit, still whispered about lights in the trees and voices in the wind. One boy claimed that while standing among the ruins, he felt the ground beneath him tremble as though something moved deep below. He ran home pale and breathless and never returned. Another girl said she dreamed of Ruth for weeks after sitting by the ruins. She said Ruth stood at her bedside each night, silent, her eyes begging for something she could not name. The girl moved away. Within the year, the new century came, and with it new voices eager to capture the old ones. Paranormal groups with cameras and recorders set up their equipment among the ruins, hoping to prove what the town already knew. They left with strange sounds on their tapes, with images blurred and twisted, with stories of shadows that moved where no living thing stood. Some of them laughed, some returned again and again, but others left shaken, swearing never to speak of it. Their reports filled the shelves of curiosity seekers across the country, and the Blackwell farm became a name not just in the town, but in the wider world. Story of sin and silence, a story that refused to die, and yet, for all the cameras, for all the questions, no one ever found the truth. The Blackwell story remained what it had always been, a wound carved into the land, a memory passed from mouth to mouth, an echo of voices that had once been silenced and could not wrest the truth of Ruth's death, the truth of Thomas's cruelty, the truth of Abigail's coldness. All of it remained buried under soil and shadow. And perhaps that was the greatest curse of all, that silence had not only destroyed a family, but had robbed history of the truth itself. Today, when the wind runs through the trees that stand where the farmhouse once rose, people say it carries with it more than just the sound of K's. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on. Still, it's good siege, me, and leave. A wall of cage walve, long last K wale walls. When the wind runs through the K's and we sieve. When we see with haze. They see with C says, it's leveling case. May, nay, my, seceive, kaliza cad, my ness, canes, by side to live, relied, by side a kaz I get. It's a gain sits a we sat a kapisaka to set it, I sit I say lip, it's kasikits, it's the abs that set is it to kick and sets to say we are. Let's speak that and so that these set of the quick because leaves, they say, it carries voices, whispers, heavy with sorrow, sighs that rise and fall, like the breathing of the land itself. Walkers who pass near the ruins speak of a sudden weight pressing on their chest, as though the silence has learned to rest on anyone who dares to listen. And though the stones are nearly gone, though the graves grow ever more weathered, the story endures. For stories like the Blackwells do not die, they grow roots. They burrow deep into the soil until even those who do not know the names can feel their weight. When children dare each other to walk past the ruins at night, they do not know Abigail's face, or Ruth's laughter, or Margaret's sorrow, or Thomas's shadow. But they know fear, they know the silence that lingers. They know the past does not let go. So is Leand, so the Blackwell mystery remains a tale of sin and silence. A tale that began in a farmhouse in the late 1800s and grew into something larger than the family larger. Then the town, a tale that belongs not only to history but to legend, for in America's past there are battles and presidents, there are victories and triumphs, but there are also families like the Blackwell's families, whose stories are not carved into monuments, but whispered into the night, families who teach us not through glory, but through the weight of silence. The Blackwells remind us that the past is never only in books. It lives in the soil, in the ruins, in the breath of wind that carries voices we cannot name it. Lives in the silence we inherit and the secrets we keep, and perhaps that is why their story has never faded, because we recognize it, because we know that sin and silence are not only their legacy but ours as well. And when the moon rises over the fields where the Blackwell farmhouse once stood, when the shadows stretch long and the air grows still, some say you can hear it, the echo of Ruth's laughter broken by sorrow, the sound of Margaret's prayers caught in her throat, the heavy tread of Thomas's boots on the stairs, and the cold stillness of Abigail's watchful gaze, a family bound together forever, not by love, not by forgiveness, but by silence, and silence is the one thing that never dies.